Hello, my name is Jesse. I'm a costume technician slash tailor, sometimes a cosplayer. I make costumes, and for this video, I'm going to be drafting a pattern for my Bayonetta cosplay. So what that involves is starting with a block pattern that's close enough to my measurements, altering that to fit me, and then finally adding the costume style lines. But first things first, I need to measure myself and the block, taking note of any discrepancies, and just quietly, there's going to be a lot. So, as you can see, I've already gone ahead and done all the measuring. It's on that little notepad you can barely see halfway across the screen. Don't worry about that, I'm going to put a graphic up later. But something to note, if you are going to be taping or padding yourself out for a costume like I am, it's important that you take these measurements with said modifications. Otherwise, it's just not going to fit. Also, for anyone paying really close attention to what I'm doing on screen, you can relax. I actually messed up my first attempt at altering the block. But that's okay. I thought I'd leave it in just to show that this is a process. Sometimes you get it right the first time, sometimes you have to erase the entire fucking page. Unsurprisingly, there was quite a bit of excess I needed to remove from the block pattern. I say that because naturally I have a masculine body type. My hip measurement isn't much wider than my chest, and the area of my torso is generally quite square. Probably more like a rectangle, but just because I'm long. But the point is, it's kind of problematic for Bayonetta's fashion proportions. To counteract that, I've padded out my chest, so that should be enough. But worst case scenario, I can pad out my hips too. Anyways, back to the pattern. I tried to simply fit out the difference of my measurements at the side seams because that's the quickest and easiest way to alter a pattern. However, as I would soon discover, it's much less disruptive to the leotard's overall shape if I remove the waist fullness evenly throughout both blocks. The idea being that I could remove the remaining hip difference later and add to the bust with my French curve as required. For reference, my waist measurement is around 69 centimeters, meaning there's a difference of 9.5 centimeters between myself and the block. The biggest difference, as I was saying earlier, is my seat measurement, which comes to 14.28 centimeters. I ended up removing 9.5 centimeters from the entire leotard, which, as you can see, is the total waist difference. But divide that by 4, that's 2.3 centimeters per pattern piece, so not a lot in the grand scheme of things. Okay, now that the leotard probably fits, I can start on the style lines. Fortunately, with video game characters, there is a lot of reference material available. The ones I used are actually straight from the Platinum Games official blog, way back when they were teasing some behind the scenes stuff for Bayonetta. So, I've started by roughly sketching in the open back section of the center back piece. A pretty good starting point, but I do want to go in again with a French curve. Usually, I wouldn't start with an opening quite so large for a stretch garment. However, because the back of Bayonetta's costume is almost all back, I took a risk just to see what would happen. Also, this is a bit experimental, but I decided to add a grown-on collar, rather than have it as a separate piece that I could attach later on. What I did was draw an 8cm extension from the original neckline, then I curved it all the way down to the original shoulder seam line. It should follow the natural curve of my neck and shoulder, but if it doesn't, that's what fittings are for. Moving along, I've started drawing in the other back style lines. Now that I have a rough idea of the open back dimensions, I can start to divide up the remaining area with those gorgeous side panels. With these kinds of details, again, I go freehand first and then correct with my French curve later on. At this stage, it's important not to get too caught up in how evenly spaced or symmetrical the panels are because I'll probably have to take it in or let it out later on. Once more, this is only half of my body on paper, so it's going to look much more organized in scale when it's fully materialized. It's like a corset pattern on the flat. As long as the pattern follows the logic of the body, we're doing okay. Once more, what I'm trying to do is to compensate for the features that I don't have by accentuating my naturally thin waist and using the artificial bust. Like, this would be way easier if I had wider hips and, breasts, so yeah, thanks Dad. Anyways, moving on to the front section, I've already marked the appropriate separation or apex of the bust, so now I can mark up the iconic opening below the neckline. I've also marked the positioning of the Umbreon timepiece prop, just to help visualize the division of space. Obviously, I don't have breasts, so I've got to be more clever in how I position this opening, and also on top of that, I'm still battling with the fact that it's stretch. So, moving on to the front style lines, it's pretty much dividing the space like I did with the center back panels, only this time I had a really good reference photo from Bayonetta's in-game model. I'm undecided as to whether I'm going to keep that gusset-shaped piece over the breast, because structurally it's kind of pointless. Like, it would be way more effort to put it in, and it only exists because in-game, that was where Bayonetta's hair elements split over the shape of her breasts, and then that connects to the chains which follow all the way along her body. I might be able to use it as a structural piece to help pad out my chest, but I don't think it's really big enough to do that. So, I'm much better off converting it to a princess line style for the fit, but for this toile I'm just going to leave it in. What I'm doing now is going through and truing all the style lines on my front section. I'm just making sure there's no jagged or uneven seams that might prove problematic when it comes time to sew. I'm also checking the new neckline and shoulder seam measurements against each other, just to make sure they match, because if you remember earlier, I drew on that extension at the collar. You'll notice I actually did the front neck extension off camera, which is totally my bad, but to go over what I did, it was the exact same process as the back neck, only instead of following the 8 centimeters all around, it finishes at the original neckline, making a V shape at the center front point. So now that the patterns are basically done, I can start tracing off all the pieces. Nothing complex here, just a lot of tracing and cutting. Under different circumstances, I would have put more than 6mm for the seam allowance, but because there's no piping in this toile and the pattern's basically redundant after this toile, I'm not going to worry about it. The purpose of this toile isn't to get the fit perfect this time around. It's more about experimenting with the style lines and getting a rough idea about how they behave on my body. I haven't used this leotard pattern on myself before, and I also haven't fitted myself with breast forms either. It's an ongoing process, and I'll probably run into more problems during the fitting. When I eventually do seam together this toile and attach lycra tubes for the arms and legs, this toile will become the basis for the new working pattern. Because after I follow those style lines on the leotard and continue them into the sleeve extensions, what I'll end up with are longer seamless panels. And I mean that in the sense that there will be no joins between the leg and the leotard panels because I'm eliminating those seams. So I'll mark these lines on the lycra with a friction pen, cut them out, and then trace them back onto the existing master pattern that I've been working on here. Also, while you're watching me frantically trace off stuff on camera, little pro tip, number and thoroughly label all of your pieces as you go. In fact, mark the orientation on the pieces as well, because you probably already know about grain lines and that's good, but there's nothing more annoying than doing something lazy that will piss off your future self. Like, if you have a corset pattern, there's nothing more masochistic than not marking the orientation or the neckline on your pattern. Like, a simple up next to the grain line will do because, as you can see with my pattern, if not for the waist and bust lines, it's very difficult to differentiate between some pieces because space is a commodity when you're sewing, and you're honestly kidding yourself if you think your pattern pieces are going to stay perfectly laid out for the whole project. So yeah, do that thing. Anyways, back to the pattern. It's all traced off and I've already gone ahead and cut it out in some cheap lycra off screen. Looking at it on the flat like this, I'm really happy with how it looks. The shaping looks right and it should fit me quite well. For the actual costume, I'm going to be cutting the bulk of it in a pleather or a vinyl of some description. But because of the nature of vinyl, I may end up cutting it twice. Like, you can sew vinyl and you can let it out, but once there's holes forever. But that's something I'm going to have to work with. That's a later problem. But looking at these front and back photos I snapped of the leotard fully assembled, you can see I've added the center front zip and I've just pinned the neckline in place of a hook and eye, which is going to be at that little closure point. The next step is the fitting, which I'll save for another video because I have to draw in those style lines and that's a whole other thing. So this seems like a good place to end it. If you have any questions about this build, please leave a comment. I'm going to be posting more videos on this and my other cosplay projects later on, so stay tuned for that, but I am more active on my Instagram, obviously. I'll leave some links in the description, but until then, bye.